Who let her touch that rifle? The voice cut through the armory just as the emergency sirens began echoing across Naval Station Blackridge. Red warning lights flashed above the steel doors while operators rushed between weapon racks and tactical crates with the speed of men who had trained for moments exactly like this. Captain Ava Mitchell didn't even look up. She sat alone at the far maintenance bench wearing a faded gray hoodie beneath a plain tactical vest, her blonde hair tied into a low ponytail as she carefully inspected the bolt assembly of a Barrett .50 caliber rifle spread across the table in front of her. Around her, the atmosphere shifted from routine to controlled urgency. Boots pounded across the concrete floor. Radios crackled non-stop. Somewhere outside, a helicopter engine roared to life in the darkness before sunrise. Yet Ava's hands never shook. Every movement remained precise, calm, almost mechanical. Logan Hayes noticed that immediately, though he would never admit it later. At 32 years old, Logan had spent nearly a decade inside special operations units, and he trusted instincts more than reports. Something about the quiet woman at the workbench felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. Still, the younger recruits standing beside him only laughed. "She's gonna break that thing," one of them muttered. "Probably thinks this is Call of Duty." Another recruit smirked and leaned against a locker. "Ma'am, Armory tours are on Thursdays." A few nearby sailors chuckled under their breath. Ava ignored every word. She slid the massive rifle barrel into position and checked the chamber with one smooth motion that looked practiced enough to belong in a training manual. Logan crossed his arms. "Hey," he called out, walking toward her. "That weapon requires authorization." Ava finally looked up. Her blue eyes were steady, unreadable. "Then you should probably authorize it." The response was quiet. No attitude. No fear. That only irritated Logan more. He stepped closer and glanced at the Barrett. The weapon had been partially disassembled because one of the sniper teams reported a cycling malfunction an hour earlier. 2 armorers had already failed to fix it. Yet somehow this woman in civilian sleeves and combat boots had the firing assembly spread out in perfect order across the table like she'd memorized every component years ago. "Who exactly are you?" Logan asked. Ava returned her attention to the rifle. "Someone trying to stop your people from carrying a broken weapon into a live response." One of the recruits scoffed loudly. "Cute answer." Another siren blasted outside, longer this time. Overhead speakers crackled to life. "All tactical response teams report to designated stations immediately." The room shifted into motion again. SEAL operators grabbed helmets and chest rigs while support crews rolled ammunition crates toward the exits. Logan reached for the Barrett. "You're done here." Ava's hand stopped him before he could touch the rifle. Not aggressively. Just enough pressure to freeze him in place. Logan frowned instantly. Her grip was solid. Controlled. The kind built from years of repetition instead of gym mirrors and ego lifting. "The extractor spring is cracked," Ava said calmly. "If your sniper fires this under pressure, the casing could jam inside the chamber." Logan stared at her for a second. Then at the rifle. Then back at her. "How would you know that?" Ava released his wrist and reached into the parts tray without answering. The room around them continued spiraling into organized chaos while she replaced the damaged spring in less than 5 seconds. Somewhere outside, another helicopter thundered overhead low enough to shake the fluorescent lights. One of the younger recruits laughed nervously. "Okay, who the hell is she?" Ava reassembled the Barrett with a final metallic click and slowly stood from the workbench. At 5'7", she wasn't physically intimidating. Nothing about her appearance screamed elite operator. No visible rank. No dramatic confidence. But when she lifted the 40-pound rifle off the table like it weighed nothing at all, the laughter in the armory began to disappear. The armory doors slammed open as another response team rushed through carrying helmets, medical packs, and communications gear. The atmosphere inside Naval Station Blackridge had changed completely in less than 10 minutes. What began as early morning routine now felt like the edge of something serious. Logan Hayes watched the woman beside the maintenance bench carefully as operators moved around her. Most civilians would have stepped out of the way by now. Most contractors would have looked nervous under the pressure and noise. Ava Mitchell did neither. She stood perfectly still with the Barrett balanced against her shoulder while her eyes tracked every movement inside the room like she was silently calculating timing, exits, and priorities all at once. Logan noticed it again. That calm. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "You still have not answered my question," he said. Ava glanced toward the digital monitor mounted near the armory entrance. Red warning icons flashed across the screen beside radar sweeps and deployment alerts. "Your North Ridge Overwatch team is late," she said quietly. Logan frowned. "Excuse me? Their transport should have moved 3 minutes ago." One of the younger recruits laughed behind him. "What is she now, psychic?" A few others smirked again, though the laughter sounded weaker than before. The tension inside the base was beginning to crush their confidence. Outside, another helicopter lifted off into the cold pre-dawn air, its rotors shaking dust loose from the ceiling vents. Logan reached for the Barrett again. "Listen carefully. Whatever game you are playing is over. This is a restricted operation." Ava handed him the rifle without resistance. "Then stop wasting time." The answer irritated him instantly. Before Logan could respond, a radio operator rushed into the armory carrying a headset against one ear. "We have another issue," the sailor shouted. "Sniper Team 2 just lost optics calibration during transport." Several men cursed under their breath. Logan looked toward the rifle in his hands, then back at Ava. "Coincidence," one recruit muttered quickly. Ava said nothing. She simply walked toward the wall-mounted tactical map near the center of the room. Nobody stopped her at first because most of them were too distracted by the alarms and radio traffic filling the air. The large digital display showed the surrounding terrain north of the base, including hills, service roads, and restricted approach zones stretching nearly 12 miles toward the coastline. Ava studied the map for only a few seconds. Then she pointed toward a narrow elevated ridge near the eastern perimeter. "If your radar signatures are real, they will approach through here." Logan stared at her. "And how exactly would you know that?" "Because it is the only route with natural signal interference from the cliffs." Her finger shifted slightly across the glowing screen. "You have a blind spot every 40 seconds when the satellite relay adjusts." The room became quieter. One of the communications specialists looked toward his monitor with confusion. "Wait," he said slowly. "She is right." Logan folded his arms tightly. "Who briefed you?" Ava looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Nobody had to." A loud metallic crash interrupted them as one of the younger recruits accidentally dropped an ammunition case onto the floor. The sharp noise echoed across the armory. Nervous energy spread instantly through the room. People were beginning to realize this situation was larger than a training exercise. Logan stepped closer to Ava, lowering his voice. "You should not know any of this." "Probably not," she replied calmly. "But your base should have fixed that blind spot 6 months ago." Logan felt the temperature in the room drop despite the noise and movement around them. There was no possible way a random civilian contractor could know classified surveillance patterns inside a restricted SEAL installation. Yet the woman standing in front of him spoke about them like someone reading notes from memory. For the first time that morning, Logan stopped seeing Ava Mitchell as an annoyance. And that realization unsettled him more than the sirens outside. The operations center above the armory erupted with overlapping radio chatter as new information flooded into the base. Large monitors mounted along the walls switched from standard patrol tracking to emergency tactical feeds. Radar sweeps pulsed across the coastline while warning indicators flashed in sharp red intervals that painted the room in restless light. Logan Hayes climbed the metal staircase toward the upper control deck with Ava Mitchell only a few steps behind him. Nobody had invited her to follow. Somehow, nobody stopped her either. The young recruits from the Armory exchanged uneasy glances as they watched her move through the base with quiet confidence, like someone who already knew where every hallway led before she ever arrived. Logan noticed it too. Every turn she made was instinctive. No hesitation. No confusion. The kind of movement people developed only after years inside secured military installations. "This area is classified," Logan said sharply once they reached the operations floor. Ava glanced toward the giant digital map dominating the center wall. "Then your security team should stop leaving side access doors unlocked during emergency rotations." Logan immediately turned toward the nearest security officer. "Is that true?" The officer hesitated. "Only for maintenance crews during rapid response situations." Ava walked directly toward the radar display before anyone answered further. The operations staff looked visibly uncomfortable watching an unidentified woman study classified surveillance feeds without clearance confirmation. One lieutenant stepped forward. "Sir, we cannot just let her stand there." Logan opened his mouth to agree, but Ava spoke first. "Your incoming signatures are splitting into two patterns now." The room quieted instantly. Several radar technicians checked their monitors. One of them frowned. "She is right." Ava pointed toward the lower section of the coastline map. "The smaller formation is not moving toward the harbor." Her fingers shifted westward. "It is bait." Logan stared at the display. The radar contacts had indeed divided less than 30 seconds earlier. Nobody had announced it yet. Nobody outside the operations desk should have even noticed. "How are you reading that so fast?" one technician asked quietly. Ava did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the movement patterns crossing the digital terrain. "Because the second group is maintaining inconsistent spacing," she finally said. "Real patrol formations do not drift like that unless they want to be seen." Logan folded his arms tighter. Every instinct told him this woman should not possess this level of tactical awareness. Yet every word leaving her mouth continued proving correct seconds later. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Nearby, two recruits whispered nervously to each other. Maybe she worked intelligence. No contractor talks like that. Then who is she? Before either could continue, the operations floor lights flickered once as backup generators activated beneath the base. The brief dimming threw shadows across the room. Ava's expression never changed. She looked completely comfortable surrounded by pressure, alarms, and uncertainty. Logan had seen that kind of composure before. Usually in operators with multiple deployments and years of combat experience. Certainly not in someone wearing a faded hoodie and no visible insignia. Admiral Cole Bennett's name suddenly echoed through the radio network. "All command personnel report immediately." The room stiffened. Several officers exchanged quick looks. Bennett rarely arrived in person unless the situation carried serious weight. Logan turned toward the communications desk. "How long until the Admiral lands?" "Approximately 8 minutes, sir." Ava finally stepped back from the radar display. "Then you have less than 8 minutes to reposition your Overwatch team before the Eastern Ridge loses visibility." One of the recruits laughed nervously again, trying to recover confidence. "You keep talking like you run this place." Ava looked directly at him for the first time all morning. Her voice remained calm, but something about it silenced the room more effectively than shouting ever could. "No," she said quietly. "I am talking like someone who has watched good teams fail because they ignored obvious problems." The recruit immediately looked away. Logan noticed it. Everyone did. There was no arrogance in her tone. No attempt to intimidate. That somehow made her words hit harder. Another radio transmission burst through the speakers overhead. "Command aircraft now entering approach corridor." The room shifted again as personnel prepared for the Admiral's arrival. But Logan Hayes barely heard any of it anymore. Because standing 3 feet away from him was a woman nobody could identify, yet somehow she knew more about their tactical vulnerabilities than half the operations staff inside the building. Rain began tapping against the reinforced windows of the operations center as the first light of dawn crept over the Pacific coastline. Naval Station Blackridge had fully transitioned into lockdown status now. Heavy steel doors sealed automatically across several lower corridors while armed response teams moved into position throughout the base. The atmosphere felt tighter by the minute. Every voice sounded lower. Every movement sharper. Logan Hayes stood near the central command table watching Ava Mitchell from across the room. She had not touched the radar displays again, yet somehow she continued noticing details before trained personnel announced them. It was beginning to unsettle everyone around her. One of the communications officers suddenly raised his headset. Eastern Overwatch just reported visual interference near the cliffs. Several technicians immediately checked their monitors. Ava remained silent beside the tactical map. Logan noticed her eyes narrow slightly toward the eastern ridge line glowing on the screen. Fog bank, one recruit guessed. Ava shook her head once. Negative. The room looked toward her again almost automatically now. Then what is it? Logan asked. Ava folded her arms. Heat distortion. A technician frowned. At this hour? Not from weather. Her gaze stayed fixed on the map. From engines. Silence spread across the operations floor. One of the radar specialists adjusted his display filters. 5 seconds later his expression changed completely. Sir, he said carefully. There are thermal traces moving below the ridge. Logan felt tension crawl into his shoulders. She had predicted another detail before the system confirmed it. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody laughed. The young recruits who mocked her earlier now watched from the back of the room without speaking at all. Ava stepped closer to the tactical table and reached for a marker beside the digital terrain overlay. Logan almost stopped her. Something made him hesitate. She circled a narrow canyon route running beneath the eastern ridge. If they continue through this corridor, she said calmly, they will disappear from satellite tracking for approximately 90 seconds before reappearing here. Her marker tapped the far side of the map. That gives them enough time to reposition equipment without your drones catching movement. One lieutenant shook his head slowly. That route was classified after the Afghanistan review. Ava looked at him briefly. I know. The answer landed heavily inside the room. Logan studied her face carefully now. There was no pride in her voice when she said things like that. No attempt to impress anyone. She simply spoke facts with the calm certainty of someone remembering old information rather than discovering it in real time. Outside the operations center windows, the flashing lights of approaching helicopters cut through the rain and fog. Admiral Cole Bennett's transport aircraft was arriving fast. Personnel throughout the room immediately straightened their posture. Logan finally stepped directly in front of Ava. Enough. His voice stayed controlled, but firmer now. Who are you really? Ava met his stare without hesitation. Someone trying to keep your people ahead of the problem. That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters right now. Logan exhaled slowly through his nose. Around them, officers prepared arrival reports while radio chatter intensified across every channel. Yet despite all the pressure flooding the base, Ava remained almost unnaturally steady. Logan noticed small details now that he somehow missed before. The faded scar running near her wrist beneath her sleeve. The pale marks along her fingers from years of weapon handling. The way she positioned herself near exits automatically without thinking about it. Every instinct inside him kept pointing toward the same impossible conclusion. This woman had operated at a level far beyond anything she appeared to be. A loud thunderclap shook the windows overhead as the helicopter finally descended outside onto the rain-soaked landing zone. The operations room stiffened instantly. "Admiral on site," a voice announced through the speakers. Logan turned toward the entrance corridor just as the main doors opened downstairs. Heavy footsteps echoed upward through the stairwell. Officers adjusted uniforms. Recruits stood straighter. The entire room prepared itself for inspection. But Ava Mitchell did not move at all. She simply watched the doorway calmly while rainwater rolled down the windows behind her and red warning lights reflected across her pale blue eyes like she had already seen moments exactly like this many times before. The operations center fell completely silent when Admiral Cole Bennett entered the room. Rainwater dripped from the shoulders of his dark navy coat as two command officers followed several steps behind him carrying classified folders and encrypted tablets. Bennett was not the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to control a room. At 60 years old, with silver hair cut close to regulation and a face weathered by decades inside Special Operations Command, his presence alone changed the atmosphere instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Operators straightened automatically. Even the younger recruits who had spent the morning joking around now looked tense under his gaze. Logan Hayes stepped forward immediately. "Sir." Bennett gave a short nod while scanning the room. "Status." The tactical officers began briefing him rapidly about the radar anomalies, the thermal signatures near the eastern ridge, and the surveillance disruption spreading across the coastline. Bennett listened without interruption, his sharp eyes moving across the digital displays with practiced focus. Then his attention shifted toward the far side of the room. Toward Ava Mitchell. For a brief second, nobody moved. Logan noticed it immediately. The Admiral's expression changed in a way he could not fully read. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Ava stood calmly beside the tactical table with her arms folded loosely across her chest, completely unaffected by the pressure surrounding her. The room waited for Bennett to demand identification or ask why an unauthorized civilian stood inside a classified operations center during lockdown. Instead, something very different happened. Admiral Bennett walked directly toward her. The heavy sound of his polished shoes crossing the operations floor echoed through the silence. One recruit shifted nervously near the back wall. Another whispered under his breath, "No way." Logan watched closely, every instinct suddenly alert. Bennett stopped less than 3 feet from Ava. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the Admiral did something that froze the entire room. He stood perfectly straight and raised his hand in a sharp military salute. Every person inside the operations center stared in stunned silence. Logan felt his stomach tighten instantly. Because senior command officers did not salute random civilians. Ava returned the salute calmly. Smoothly. Like someone who had performed the motion thousands of times before. "Good to see you again, Captain," Bennett said quietly. The room went still. Completely still. One of the recruits actually took a half-step backward in confusion. Logan looked at Ava again, this time as if seeing her for the first time all morning. "Captain." The title echoed in his head harder than the emergency sirens outside. Bennett lowered his hand slowly. "I expected you 2 hours ago." Ava glanced toward the radar screens. "Your eastern surveillance gap delayed my approach." The Admiral nodded once, almost like that answer confirmed something he already suspected. Logan finally found his voice. "Sir, you know her." Bennett looked toward him carefully. "Commander Hayes," he said, "you are standing in the presence of one of the most decorated reconnaissance officers this command has ever produced." Nobody in the room breathed. Ava looked slightly uncomfortable under the sudden attention, which somehow made the moment feel even more real. Bennett continued calmly. "Captain Ava Mitchell served in joint operations for 12 years under assignments that remain classified above your current clearance level." Several operators exchanged stunned glances. The younger recruits who mocked her earlier looked completely speechless now. Logan felt heat rise in his face as pieces of the morning slammed together all at once. The tactical knowledge. The weapon handling. The calm under pressure. The confidence around classified systems. None of it had been accidental. Ava had not acted like she belonged because she wanted attention. She acted that way because she actually did belong. More than any of them realized. Bennett turned toward the tactical display again. Captain Mitchell warned you about the eastern blind spot, correct? Logan nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Then I suggest you start listening very carefully. The Admiral's tone remained calm, but the weight behind his words landed hard across the room. Ava stepped quietly toward the operations table again while every eye inside the command center followed her now for completely different reasons than before. Not with mockery anymore. Not with doubt. With the uneasy respect people feel when they suddenly realize the quietest person in the room was the most dangerous professional there the entire time. The atmosphere inside the operations center changed completely after Admiral Bennett revealed who Ava Mitchell really was. Nobody spoke casually anymore. The young recruits who had mocked her earlier now avoided eye contact whenever she moved past them. Even the experienced operators carried themselves differently around her, as if the entire room suddenly realized they had been standing beside someone whose reputation existed far above their level of clearance. Rain hammered against the windows harder now while the tactical displays continued updating in sharp bursts of red and amber. The Eastern Ridge signatures were moving faster. Ava stood beside the central command table studying the shifting terrain overlays while Bennett reviewed incoming reconnaissance reports with his senior officers. Logan Hayes remained unusually quiet near the back of the room. The embarrassment still sat heavy in his chest. Every sarcastic comment from earlier replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. He had treated Captain Ava Mitchell like an inconvenience when she had probably forgotten more about tactical operations than most people inside Blackridge would ever learn. A communications specialist suddenly lifted his headset. "Sir, Eastern Overwatch is requesting immediate optics support." Bennett looked toward Ava without hesitation. "Your assessment?" Ava stepped closer to the display. "Their current angle is compromised by rain distortion." Her finger moved across the terrain map. "Relocate Team 2 approximately 400 yards south along the ridge line." One lieutenant frowned immediately. "That position reduces visibility toward the northern approach." "Only temporarily," Ava replied calmly. "But it gives them a cleaner thermal read through the canyon opening." The lieutenant still looked uncertain. Bennett nodded once. "Do it." The order moved instantly through the communications network. Logan noticed something important then. Bennett never second-guessed her. Not once. That level of trust inside Special Operations Command was not given lightly. It had to be earned through years of flawless judgment under pressure. One of the younger recruits quietly approached Logan near the rear equipment station. "Sir," he whispered carefully, "is she really that good?" Logan looked toward Ava standing under the flashing tactical lights. "Better than good," he admitted quietly. Across the room, another alert sounded from the radar systems. A new cluster of thermal signatures appeared near the lower canyon route exactly where Ava predicted earlier. Several technicians stared at their screens in disbelief. "Movement confirmed," one of them announced. "She called it almost 20 minutes ago." Ava remained focused on the tactical map while command personnel rushed to adjust positioning data across the operations floor. She did not react to the praise. She did not act impressed with herself. That calm professionalism somehow made her presence even more intimidating. Bennett crossed his arms beside her. "Do you think this is the main operation?" Ava shook her head slowly. "No," the room quieted again. "This is preparation." Logan stepped forward carefully. "Preparation for what?" Ava studied the terrain display for another second before answering. "Testing response time. Mapping reaction patterns. Seeing how fast Blackridge moves under pressure." Several officers exchanged uneasy looks. That possibility had not occurred to most of them yet. Ava continued speaking in the same steady voice. Whoever is out there already knew where your surveillance gaps existed. Her eyes shifted toward the Eastern Ridge display again. That means they have either studied this base for a long time, she paused slightly. Or someone already gave them the information. Silence spread heavily through the operations center. Even the radio chatter suddenly sounded distant beneath the weight of that possibility. One recruit swallowed hard near the back wall. Logan felt tension tighten through the room instantly. Suspicion inside military installations changed everything. Bennett's expression hardened slightly. You believe there is a leak? Ava did not answer immediately. She simply reached toward the tactical monitor and enlarged the Eastern Canyon feed. A faint movement pattern flashed briefly across the thermal display before disappearing behind heavy rain interference. I believe, she said quietly, that somebody expected Blackridge to stay blind much longer than it did. Another alarm pulsed overhead. But this time nobody panicked. Nobody rushed blindly through the room. Because now every person inside the operations center understood one thing with absolute certainty. Captain Ava Mitchell was seeing the battlefield several moves ahead of everyone else. The rain finally began easing outside Naval Station Blackridge, but the tension inside the operations center only grew heavier. Every screen across the command floor now displayed live feeds from the Eastern Ridge and Canyon routes. Thermal overlays pulsed in sharp waves across the terrain while surveillance drones repositioned overhead through the fading storm clouds. Nobody underestimated Captain Ava Mitchell anymore. The room had moved beyond skepticism. What unsettled them now was how accurately she continued predicting every shift before the systems confirmed it. Admiral Bennett stood beside the command table reviewing incoming updates while Logan Hayes coordinated repositioning orders across the eastern perimeter teams. The younger recruits remained unusually quiet near the communications wall. Earlier that morning they had laughed when Ava touched a Barrett rifle. Now they watched her like junior sailors standing near a living legend they barely understood. One of the radar technicians suddenly straightened in his chair. Movement spike, he announced quickly. Multiple thermal contacts appeared near the lower canyon entrance. The room immediately focused on the central display. Ava stepped forward calmly. Zoom Sector 7. The image expanded across the main screen, revealing faint vehicle signatures moving slowly beneath the ridge line. Logan narrowed his eyes. That is farther south than expected. Ava nodded once. Because they adjusted after realizing the eastern blind spot closed. Bennett looked toward her carefully. Meaning somebody out there knows Blackridge corrected position faster than anticipated. The implication landed heavily again. Someone observing their responses in real time. The room grew tense. A communications officer spoke into his headset rapidly before looking back toward command. Sniper Team 2 confirms partial visual through the canyon opening, but rain residue on optics is causing interference. Ava's eyes remained fixed on the terrain feed. What is their elevation? Approximately 800 feet above canyon level. Too high, she replied immediately. Logan looked toward her. You think they should reposition again? Ava pointed toward a lower ridge contour near the center of the map. Move them there. One lieutenant frowned. That drops them closer to the canyon floor. Exactly. Her finger tapped the display once. The current angle creates thermal distortion against wet rock surfaces. Lower elevation gives cleaner tracking through the fog break. The lieutenant hesitated only briefly this time before relaying the order. Nobody questioned her judgment anymore. They had already learned that arguing with Ava Mitchell usually meant discovering she was right a few minutes later. Across the operations floor, one of the younger recruits quietly approached another operator. How does she know all this? The older sailor answered without looking away from the screens. People like her survive because they notice things everybody else misses. Moments later the sniper feed stabilized. Clearer thermal signatures emerged near the canyon entrance exactly as Ava predicted. Several operators exchanged stunned looks again. Logan exhaled slowly through his nose. Unbelievable. Ava barely reacted. She leaned slightly closer toward the tactical display, studying movement patterns with absolute focus. Then her expression shifted for the first time all morning. Only slightly. But Logan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Ava's eyes narrowed toward the lower canyon feed. "That truck is wrong." Bennett looked toward the screen. "Wrong how?" "It is too exposed." The thermal image showed a single vehicle pausing near the canyon opening before slowly repositioning again. Nobody trying to stay hidden would move that openly unless they wanted attention. Logan folded his arms tightly. "Another distraction?" Ava nodded. "Most likely." Her gaze shifted toward the western edge of the map. "The real movement is probably happening somewhere nobody is watching." Before anyone could respond, one of the surveillance operators suddenly turned pale. "Sir," he said carefully. "We just lost drone feed over Sector 4. Several alarms pulsed instantly across the operations floor." Bennett stepped toward the display sharply. "Cause?" "Unknown." Ava looked toward the western coastline on the map. "Sector 4 covers the fuel access route." The room froze again. Logan felt tension slam through his chest. Because if she was right, then everything happening near the eastern canyon had only been designed to pull Blackridge's attention away from somewhere far more important. Ava slowly straightened beside the tactical table while warning lights reflected across her calm expression. "They were never testing the base," she said quietly. "They were testing how easy it would be to redirect all of you at the same time." The operations center exploded into motion the second the drone feed vanished over Sector 4. Warning indicators flashed across every monitor while communications officers rushed to reconnect surveillance coverage along the western fuel corridor. The comm control Blackridge maintained earlier was gone now. Personnel moved faster. Voices grew sharper. Even experienced operators looked unsettled by how quickly the situation had changed. Admiral Bennett stepped toward the Central Command display. "Get visual confirmation on Sector 4 immediately." "Attempting now, sir," a technician answered while typing rapidly across multiple systems. Logan Hayes grabbed a headset from the command table and began redirecting response teams toward the western perimeter. But before he could finish issuing orders, Ava Mitchell reached over calmly and lowered the microphone from his hand. "Do not send everyone west." Logan looked at her sharply. "If they hit the fuel corridor, we cannot sit still." "Exactly," Ava replied quietly. "That is what they want." The room slowed again around her words. Bennett studied her carefully. "Explain." Ava enlarged the tactical map across the main display. Rainwater still streaked across the operations center windows behind her while the remaining radar feeds pulsed across the dark coastline. "The Eastern Canyon operation was bait," she said calmly. "The fuel corridor disruption is Phase 2. Her finger traced a line between both sectors. "If Blackridge shifts full tactical response west, the Central Harbor entrance becomes exposed for approximately 6 minutes. One communications officer immediately checked the timing calculations. His eyes widened. "She is correct." Logan stared at the map. He hated admitting it, but she had seen another move ahead of everyone again. Bennett folded his arms tightly. "So where is the real target?" Ava looked toward the harbor overlay glowing near the center of the display. "Right here." Silence spread through the room. The harbor controlled Blackridge's classified supply access and submarine maintenance channels. If someone mapped its response vulnerabilities, the consequences would reach far beyond one military installation. Logan felt a cold realization settle in his chest. This had never been random surveillance. Someone had studied Blackridge carefully enough to manipulate its entire defensive posture step by step. Ava turned toward the radar operators. "Keep half the response teams east. Redirect only mobile units west." Her eyes shifted toward the harbor feed. And place thermal surveillance across the central docks immediately. Nobody questioned her now. Orders moved instantly across the operations center. Operators adjusted drone routes while harbor security teams activated additional scanners along the waterfront. Ava remained standing beside the tactical table with complete composure, speaking in the same calm tone she had used since entering the base hours earlier. Logan watched her carefully while teams repositioned throughout Blackridge. The recruits who mocked her that morning now looked at her with something close to disbelief. One of them quietly muttered under his breath, "She saw the whole thing before any of us." Another nodded slowly. "That is why people like her end up classified." Moments later a harbor surveillance operator suddenly leaned toward his monitor. Contact movement near Dock 3. The room snapped toward the display. A faint thermal shape appeared briefly near one of the restricted maintenance corridors before disappearing behind heavy rain interference. Ava's expression sharpened slightly. Freeze frame. The image locked across the main screen. Logan narrowed his eyes toward the blurred movement signature. "Can you enhance it?" "Working on it now." Ava stared at the paused image for several seconds without speaking. Then she pointed toward a barely visible reflection near the lower edge of the frame. "That is not harbor equipment." Bennett stepped closer. "What is it?" Ava answered quietly. "Portable signal masking gear." The room went still again. Because portable masking systems capable of bypassing military thermal detection were not common equipment. Someone had arrived prepared. Logan slowly lowered his headset onto the command table. Earlier that morning he thought Ava Mitchell was a civilian who wandered into the wrong armory. Now she stood at the center of Blackridge command operations while senior officers followed her assessments without hesitation. And the most unsettling part was realizing she still looked completely calm while the rest of the base struggled to keep up with a threat she had recognized almost from the beginning. By late morning the storm had finally passed over Naval Station Blackridge, leaving the coastline wrapped in cold gray fog and silence broken only by distant helicopter rotors above the harbor. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere felt completely different from the chaos that filled the base just a few hours earlier. The tactical alarms had stopped. The emergency lights no longer flashed across the walls. Surveillance feeds now showed secured harbor corridors and stabilized perimeter routes after response teams successfully intercepted the unauthorized signal masking equipment near Dock 3 before the breach could spread deeper into the installation. Nobody celebrated loudly. People inside Blackridge understood how close the situation had come to slipping beyond control. And they also understood who saw it first. Captain Ava Mitchell stood quietly near the rear observation window overlooking the harbor while crews below reset security checkpoints along the docks. The faded gray hoodie she arrived in earlier was still damp from the rain, though she looked as composed as she had the moment she first entered the armory carrying the Barrett rifle. Logan Hayes approached slowly beside her, no longer carrying the sharp confidence he wore that morning. For several seconds he said nothing. He simply looked out across the harbor with his hands folded behind his back. Finally he spoke. "I owe you an apology." Ava glanced toward him briefly. "For what?" Logan let out a quiet breath. "For judging you before I knew who you were." Ava looked back toward the harbor again. "That happens more than you think." There was no bitterness in her voice. No anger. Somehow that only made Logan feel worse about it. He remembered the jokes in the armory. The sarcasm. The assumptions based entirely on appearance and silence. He had spent years teaching recruits not to underestimate situations in the field, yet he failed to follow his own lesson the second someone walked into the room looking different from what he expected. The recruits were embarrassed, Logan admitted quietly. Ava gave the smallest nod. "Good." Logan looked surprised. Ava continued calmly. "Embarrassment teaches faster than lectures." For the first time all morning, Logan almost smiled. Nearby, several younger operators glanced toward Ava from across the operations center. Earlier they had watched her with skepticism. Now the looks carried something entirely different. Respect. Not because Admiral Bennett revealed her rank. Not because of classified stories or reputation. But because they had watched her remain calm while everybody else struggled to catch up. Admiral Bennett stepped onto the observation level moments later carrying a classified folder beneath one arm. "The Harbor Command team confirmed your assessment," he said. "The Eastern Canyon activity was designed to split response coverage exactly the way you predicted." Ava nodded once. Bennett studied her carefully before speaking again. "You could stay, you know. Blackridge would benefit from someone like you." Ava smiled faintly for the first time that day. Blackridge already has good people. Her eyes shifted briefly toward Logan and the younger operators nearby. They just needed reminding to slow down and pay attention. Bennett gave a quiet laugh beneath his breath. "Still giving lessons after all these years?" Ava shrugged lightly. "Old habits." Outside the harbor windows, sunlight finally began breaking through the clouds across the Pacific water. The tension hanging over the base slowly started fading with it. Crews returned to normal operations while helicopters circled farther offshore toward routine patrol routes again. Logan watched Ava pick up the Barrett case resting beside the observation wall. Even carrying nearly 40 pounds of equipment, she moved with the same controlled ease she showed from the beginning. One of the younger recruits finally stepped forward nervously. "Captain Mitchell." Ava stopped. "Yes." The recruit swallowed hard before speaking. "How did you know something was wrong so early?" Ava studied him for a moment before answering. "Because experienced people do not look for what is obvious." Her eyes moved briefly across the operations floor one last time. "They look for what feels out of place." The recruit nodded slowly, like somebody hearing a lesson that would stay with him for years. Ava gave a final salute toward Admiral Bennett and quietly walked toward the exit corridor without waiting for attention or praise. The room remained silent as she disappeared down the hallway. And long after she was gone, the people inside Naval Station Blackridge remembered the same thing. The quiet woman they laughed at in the armory turned out to be the one person who understood the battlefield better than all of them.